Good afternoon. Happy New Year, everybody. It's hard to believe it's the new year already. We've had winter and summer and spring just in like 1 week, 2 week period, but it's good. It's Nashville, and it's good to be here in Nashville. My name is Gail Carr-Williams, and I'm Associate Director of Community, Neighborhood, and Government Relations at Vanderbilt University, and I want to welcome you to this Food for Thought. We've been very fortunate to have just an amazing partnership with the Frist Center for Visual Arts to bring these 3 lectures to you, and this is the final lecture of Visualizing America through the works of 30 Americans in Norman Rockwell. And I hope all of you got a chance to see the exhibits. And if you haven't seen Norman Rockwell, it's still upstairs. And I sort of encourage you all to get a badge if you don't already have one to go up and see it. And 30 Americans unfortunately closed this weekend, but hopefully most of you all had an opportunity to see that. What great exhibits, and what a great jewel to have here in Nashville, the Frist Center, to bring this kind of art to our community that we can all enjoy. I don't know if many of you went to see Carrie Mae Weems, and I'm taking a little more time than I should, but we're so excited at the Frist Center that that same exhibit is opening in New York City, and it started right here at the Frist Center. So that is vision, and that is just a testament to the wonderful work that's done here at the Frist Center for Visual Arts. So, and if you haven't already purchased your Frist membership, there's somebody out there that can assist you in doing that. And they have been a good partner to this program, and they're a good partner in our community. So I encourage all of you just to stop, and if not, I think you can go online and get one as well, all right? And the gift shop is also out there with some wonderful things in there. So now, on to the exciting part, right? Woo! We have an amazing panel today that I am just so excited that they all said yes to. And what a wonderful opportunity to have the curator of this most wonderful jewel to moderate our panel today, Mark Scala. I mean, how lucky are we to have you, Mark? So thank you for moderating. Thank you for saying yes. Also on our panel today, we have Stephanie Pruitt, and we have Frank Dobson, and we have Professor Vivian Free, all from Vanderbilt. So really grateful to have all of them, and I have all of their bios on the sheet that all of you should have received. So on behalf of Vanderbilt University, thank you for being here, and I will now turn it over to Mark. And thanks again for being here, and look for Food for Thought at other locations throughout the spring. So thank you all very much.
Thanks very much, Gail. Can you all hear me? Okay. Actually, could I ask all the panelists to say something pithy into your mic so they can hear you too? Frank?
Oh, such pressure. Let's see. How is this sound-wise?
Good?
Hello, everybody.
Good afternoon, y'all.
All right, I can hear them really well. All right. Well, let's start with a provocation, if we can. Let's see. There we go. So, heroes, the question of heroes. When this came up, I thought, well, this is an odd conversation to have in relation to 30 Americans in Norman Rockwell. And of course, anytime there's something odd, it piques your curiosity. And so I went and really looked at these exhibitions and asked myself, and then we asked ourselves as a panel, what are we going to talk about? There's so many different directions to go in. What is a hero? There are personal heroes, your mom. There are ideological heroes, your favorite politician. And then there are the transcendent heroes. And which ones are these artists interested in? Which ones should we talk about? I thought it was interesting that a Facebook friend of mine, Rebecca Solnit, who is herself a wonderful author, wonderful researcher, wonderful way of words, sent out this posting. Now, as you look at that, you may think, yeah, they're heroes, but no, he's not a hero to me. And then the question of heroism really is brought to the forefront. You know, what is a hero to one person isn't necessarily a hero to another. So what are the intrinsic traits of a hero, of heroism? Is it courage? Is it emulability? If that is a word. Frank, is that a word?
I think so.
Emulability?
Yes,
I like
indeed,
it if it's not.
is.
Okay, good. What constitutes a hero, and how do we really suss out this question? It was easier in the old days, it seems. I mean, you take a look at David's very famous painting of the death of Marat, or Greeno's wonderful and kind of strange to our eyes neoclassical representation of George Washington as Zeus. You know, things were simpler back then. Marat, of course, was a great champion of the French Revolution, the great champion of people's rights. But Marat was also one of the architects of the terror, hence his assassination. So even though David has painted him in this with his Christ-like aura, a man of letters who dies passively in his bathtub, we know that the notion of the hero is a double-edged notion. And George Washington, what was the quote that you had on George Washington, Vivian?
So Nathaniel Hawthorne said, "Did anyone ever see Washington naked? It is inconceivable. He has not nakedness, but I imagine was born with his clothes on and his hair powdered." And another person said, "Washington was too prudent and wise to expose himself thus in a climate so uncertain as ours, especially in Nashville, to say nothing of the indecency of such an exposure."
So heroes are oftentimes a little uncomfortable with their apotheoses, I guess, is what the message is. So the question about heroes, well, why are we even interested in heroes anymore? I mean, aren't we too grown up for heroes? And I guess the answer is something that lies in each of our hearts. And to me, a hero is somebody who is a catalyst for transformation, whether it's a personal transformation or a social transformation. A hero is a role model, but maybe something more than a role model. I think we have always expected our heroes to be somehow Zeus-like or God-like or absolutely pure, but then we realize that many of our heroes, many of the JFKs, the Martin Luther Kings, the Bill Clintons, have their flaws. And so, I think that becomes a very interesting thing. It's part of our maturation. It's not the fault of the person who is heroicized, because after all, they don't necessarily think of themselves as heroes. So it's an interesting kind of challenge and point of conversation for us. What is the language of heroism, or I should say the language of the visual representation of heroism? We all know Shepard Fairey's portrait of Obama, and what does that portrait say to us? Obviously, it's a text-image link, and the text is very clear, very simple, and the reinforcement of that text is Obama looking off kind of slightly above the horizon. He's looking in an aspirational way toward a positive future. And so we look at his eyes, we look at the set of his jaw, we look at the determination, we look at the flat colors and remind ourselves of the language of, say, the 1930s Mexican printmaking, in which printmaking was a very, very political enterprise. And then the conservative commentators would say something like, it looks just like that Che Guevara poster. So obviously there's a Marxist implication to this. And then all you need to do is add a mustache to it. And so there is an iconography of heroism. And when you put somebody up on a pedestal, it's particularly easy to knock them down from the same pedestal, or to tweak the iconicism, the iconography just a little bit in order to de-heroicize, as if you take somebody off a pedestal who never put themselves on the pedestal in the first place, you somehow subvert the entire thing that they stand for. So it's a really interesting and complicated thing. So let's look at some works of art in the two exhibitions. There are some differences that are probably fairly immediately apparent to you. So the question to the panel is, the first question, and I'll just let whomever wishes to answer. What would you say are the differences between the two shows in terms of their approach to the representation of the heroic, to the idea of hero worship in general?
Well, I think one major difference is that the Rockwell show introduces us to an artist who is often creating works for hire, knowing that the works had a predetermined audience or place to be published, and that the images would be communicating a specific message. Whereas in 30 Americans, presumably many of the artists are working out of an internal motivation, maybe a curiosity, without an assurance of publication or a gallery or museum show. And I think that makes a difference in how the images and how people in these images are portrayed.
Do you think Rockwell didn't actually believe in the heroism of any of the heroes that he represented?
Oh, I think he absolutely did. And you see the wit, you see the nuance, you see the detail and the research that he's doing on his subject. So I believe he's really an interesting example of an artist who, despite doing works for hire, is really using research and craft to fully express and develop the artistic merit also.
And I would say that for the 30 Americans, that most of those artists who are African American are deliberately critiquing and asking us to question what we consider to be a hero and why is somebody considered to be a hero. So if you looked at the work of art that's on your right by Johnson, you may not know just looking at it that it's actually a portrait, and I'm blanking out on the name.
Frederick Douglass.
Frederick Douglass, and we all know who Frederick Douglass is. But the subtitle tells us Thurgood, and we all know Thurgood Marshall was the first African-American Supreme Court justice. But when you take a look at the work, it's not clear who the person is and how this person is being idolized. So you're forced to begin to think about, well, who do we consider to be a hero? Why do we consider them to be a hero? How do you represent that person? And I think it leads to more questions, whereas with Rockwell, there are never any questions that we ask. We know who the hero is, and it's very obvious to us.
I'd like to add that there's a quote that one of the artists from the 30 Americans said that I wrote in my notebook, and I'm going to read just the last part of it. Hank Willis Thomas wrote this, in reality, black men are in many ways the most feared and hated bodies of the 21st century. And so when I look at this piece by Johnson, not by Willis, and I look at some of the other pieces, I realize that what Willis and his compatriots are doing with this 30 American show is they're really looking at color lines, and they're looking at lines that divide us, and they're looking at those questions of fear and hatred and division, and they're interrogating those questions. And clearly, I think what they're saying to us is we have to go back and look at the history, hence this representation of this young black man as Douglass and the notation of Thurgood Marshall. And of course, we know Douglass and Marshall as leaders, heroes, if you will, who interrogated and questioned and critiqued this whole question of the color line and this whole question of integration, segregation, and those kinds of things. So I would like to look at the 30 Americans in terms of the question of those lines that have divided us. And I would argue that Rockwell also deals with those lines that seemingly divide us.
And in the portrait on the right, there's literally a line in his face. Mm-hmm. So you've got a color line. You always say things that lead me in another direction.
Yeah, we've noticed that, yeah.
So you've got a lighter portion on the face on the left and a darker portion on the right. So
I wonder if this notion, what we're really talking about is deconstructing the idea of the hero, and we're talking about it with 30 Americans in the context of African American perspective and experience. But it also seems to me that if you think about the broader art world, there really isn't necessarily a great deal of heroicizing, I think, that goes on in general, is there? I mean, when you compare the contemporary world to, and I think it may be part of the tenor of postmodernism, right, the suspicion that one has, yes, over the construction or the fabrication of a presumably or putatively heroic identity.
Well, it fits in with the idea of the death of the author and the questioning about how somebody becomes a genius, and that the artist is a genius as a man, and all of those issues get.
Can any of you speak to the idea then, following up on that, of deconstructing this notion of the hero in the context, say, of Shanique Smith's, essentially a tribute to Tupac Shakur, or the wonderful John Henry by David Hammonds?
Yeah.
You could break it down for us. What do these things tell us?
Well, the work of art on your right is, if you've seen the show, and unfortunately it's down, when you take a look at it, you're actually seeing a rock that's on top of a railroad, what would you call it?
Tie. A steel railroad tie.
A steel railroad tie. Mm-hmm. And then there's hair on the rock. You would only know by reading the title that it's supposed to be a portrait of John Henry. And then you may know the song about John Henry, right, and you would know that this is a person who was killed by a locomotive, but then it becomes even more important when you learn that he was an African American. So all of that comes into play. The only thing here that's really telling you anything about him is the railroad tie. But the face, which is a rock, is faceless. So is it really a portrait of a specific individual? Is it asking you to think about that one individual? Is it asking you to realize that John Henry gets erased over time in history? And all of those issues come into play. And for the Smith, we're looking at something that's supposed to be a memorial to a rapper who was brutally murdered. But there's nothing here that is telling you anything about that. So again, you don't have any answers in these works. You only have a series of questions. And your questions are always going to be ongoing, and you're never going to be able to answer them.
I think there's an interesting kind of meditation on the construction of a hero, or even the myth, kind of the myth-making work that's done in shaping heroes. When we look at the piece on the right, reflecting John Henry, they're quite literally construction materials. A rock or a stone, the railroad tie, steel. They're physical materials that are used to build. And the myth, the story of John Henry over the years and over generations has been built as his cultural myth of a man who had formerly been enslaved, who was said to be the strongest man ever, who actually raced a locomotive and was able to build a railroad faster than a locomotive. And you know how the stories are passed down, from one person to two, if you've ever played the telephone game where you kind of pass a secret around and it changes every time. I think that's the way often myths and heroes are constructed in our culture. And I love the detail of having the hair, as Vivian mentioned, on top of the rock, because as we read more about the artist's process, he gathered hair from barbershops, where presumably are these cultural community spaces where people, of course, go for this utilitarian function of getting their hair cut. But if you've ever sat on a barbershop on a Saturday morning, I've taken my nephew, what's really happening is storytelling and the sharing of information, myth-making, the braggadocious kind of, not the stories that you would necessarily tell at the dinner table, but it's one of the cultural spaces of myth-making, which I think is highly reflective of the way the artist is adding to this idea of John Henry as a hero, kind of constructing that.
I just want to add a couple of things. I was doing some research last semester on a wonderful film by John Ford entitled Sergeant Rutledge, where he's memorializing the Buffalo Soldiers. And in doing that, and there's actually a song called Captain Buffalo that sort of takes its cadences and its rhythms from the John Henry song. And so I did some research, and there actually was a historical figure on whom the John Henry myth is based. I'm sure there's a lot of embellishment. So I want to throw that out. But the other piece that I'd like to suggest is that the hair is so significant because in African American culture, and of course I don't have any hair any longer, but in African American culture, hair is such a signifier, not only of looks and all of that, but of politics, right? The afros of the 60s said something. There's that iconic picture of Angela Davis with the big afro, right? And so, even, going back to the Frederick Douglass piece or looking at this in the woolly hair, which of course in our community for so long, the African American community, was looked at in the pejorative as a negative, but indeed this is embraced here in this piece as in the Frederick Douglass piece. So I would suggest that the hair is such a signifier of that's very deeply embedded in African American culture.
Let me pull you all very quickly. When I showed these, put these two slides up, did you understand the content? Did you recognize the kind of the questioning or the relationship between the subject and the title and the hero, the idea of the hero? Raise your hand if yes. Okay, and I think that point of accessibility is really very interesting and very important, especially in the conversation with Rockwell. We talked about Rockwell in the context of advertising, the last food for thought. And of course, the point of advertising is to be absolutely clear, is to you're not really asking people to ask questions. You're really telling people, you're making a declarative kind of statement and an affirmation of something, whereas, of course, these artists are really inviting you. They're trying to pique your curiosity, and I think that's a significant difference. Well, let's talk about some things that the exhibitions might have in common. I think there is some common ground. If you think about the use of the idea of heroism as an embodiment of a cultural value, the cultural value that you want to perpetuate, you want to propagate. And of course, I think it's really interesting. I've always loved the fact that the word propaganda derives from the term propagate. So that question of propaganda, I think, is interesting in the context of Rockwell in particular. But take a look at these two images, and let's talk about the kind of linkages of messages here.
Am I first again? Well,
who wants to go first?
the work of art on the left by Ligon.
Yeah.
You'd have to know. Again, these are works of art that you can't read them immediately. You have to take a look at it and read what the text is and about being black is beautiful, etc. Going to Africa and then that they don't even know who this person is. But then you have to know who's being quoted here and that it's Richard Pryor. Then you have to know, and I think everybody here knows who Richard Pryor is, a black comedian, but he was a black comedian who was on edge and who was dealing with racial issues in a very overt fashion that, I mean, it was really in your face, and he was pushing the envelope. And really, I think one of the first to push the envelope about race as a comedian. So all of those issues come into play, and the fact that it's typed up and that it's set against this gold ground, that you have this sense of preciousness, this sense of fame, and you can think of somebody like Andy Warhol, who does these images of like Marilyn Monroe against a gold background. And then if you take a look at the Rockwell, you have an anonymous person. And in fact, you have a group of anonymous people. Clearly the man who's standing is the hero. We don't know what he's a hero about, but we know, given, say, freedom of speech by war bonds, we know that this is about the freedom of speech. It's about the First Amendment. It's about American freedom. And then you know the date that this is done. It's created during the Second World War. So it then gets tied into everything connected with the Second World War and that American democracy and that we're fighting against the Nazis, et cetera.
I would like to pick up on some of the things that you were talking about, Vivian. And the thing about Rockwell that always appealed to me, and my mother was a big fan of Rockwell, was his evocation of the common man and woman. I would argue that really was the lure and the attraction of Richard Pryor in the African American community. Picking up on what you said, Stephanie, because if you really examine Richard Pryor's comedy, it was about the black common man, common woman. He took us into the barbershops. He took us onto the street corners. He was sort of almost like that Langston Hughes character, Jesse B. Simple, because he would take us into those places that were just ordinary, everyday people. And what he ended up doing, even though much of Richard Pryor's stick was about the foibles and the flaws, but he would also show us the humanity within the common folk that his comedic routines were very much a part of. And so I would argue that, the Richard Pryor reference really has resonance when one thinks about the work and the art of Rockwell, who also elevated the common person and showed us that which was extraordinary within the ordinary.
Sure. I think anytime you engage with a work of art where there's text, we have these expectations. We walk into a piece and, most of us being literate people, we assume we will be able to read this text and understand what it means. As a poet, I often encounter, people who say they don't like poetry because they don't understand it. It's not telling them what's supposed to happen. And I can read, but why don't I fully understand this? I think we see that in Ligon's work, as Vivian mentioned. And of course, the Rockwell work, being a poster meant to be posted in large spaces, has a clarity of message that we've mentioned before. But I think part of what we have to ask ourselves is, can we assume that these artists are actually consciously engaged in hero shaping? With Rockwell and the composition of this image, the purpose of the image, I think we can safely say yes. With the Glenn Ligon image, quoting Richard Pryor, I don't know if we can automatically assume that he is raising this quote, this idea and concept to kind of heroicism or a heroic level of thought. I think it can be kind of tricky water when we start making assumptions about an artist's intent. I think part of what we're doing as viewers is engaging with the image, with the information that might accompany the image, and working through kind of the intent. We can't necessarily assume that the artist is actually saying this is how we should think and be. I think it's asking us questions for, how we interpret the content. So and if, this is another obvious thing that I think we should just kind of talk about. Obviously, the Norman Rockwell show is a solo retrospective. It's a single artist, whereas 30 Americans represents the perspective and the work of 31 artists, different artists. And so their methodology, the materials they're using, the media are all different. So I think it's a really nice juxtaposition to talk about heroes through the lens of really 32 individual artists.
I think that's a great point, the idea of the artist's role in creating the notion of the hero. And when you look at Ligon's work especially, you might say, well, who is the hero? What is heroic?
Right.
Not necessarily who is the hero, but what is heroic? And it's almost an implicit kind of on the side sort of sense that the person, Pryor is heroic because he takes risks. The man in the Norman Rockwell is taking risks, presumably. He may be voicing an unpopular opinion. I think that's kind of the implication. He's not speaking for everybody else, but everybody else is being tolerant. And so this notion of tolerance is, I think, part of the conversation as well. So the thing that is heroic may be a person, it may be an idea. And in this case, maybe the heroic idea is the First Amendment. And so I think it broadens the sense of the things that, it's about the things that we value and what is it that embodies the things that we value, I think is kind of the interesting conversation between these two exhibitions. We talked a little bit about the way the artist, the role of the artist in shaping the notion of the hero in a way that's very different from what a newspaper account will do, maybe even different from what a film will do, a biography will do, a historian, a political strategist might do. How is what the artist does in some ways special?
I'll go.
This is you, Frank. This whole idea came from you. Yes.
This is me. I'm going to read something. This is obviously a reference to the Ruby Bridges situation when Ruby Bridges integrated a school in New Orleans back in 1960. And I was doing some reading this morning on the Ruby Bridges situation, and I thought of a quotation from James Baldwin in The Fire Next Time, which is real brief, and just bear with me as I read it. And this is what Baldwin says, and he's clearly talking about heroic action and heroism. And he says this: "The Negro boys and girls who are facing mobs today come out of a long line of improbable aristocrats, the only genuine aristocrats this country has produced." And then further on he says this in The Fire Next Time: "I am proud of these people, not because of their color, but because of their intelligence and their spiritual force and their beauty." And indeed, when one studies the situation with Ruby Bridges, her parents were reluctant, her parents were sort of divided. Should we send our daughter to these schools? And of course, there was a lot of opposition, and you see that depicted in the Rockwell piece. And it's so ironic because there were 4 little black girls who were integrating the schools in New Orleans. 3 girls were at one school, and Ruby went to the other school by herself. And this picture clearly shows that isolation. And so I think one of the things that Rockwell is doing here is this whole notion of not only the heroic action by the little girl, but the invisible heroes, and we talked a little bit about this in an earlier session, are the parents. Because the parents are sacrificing themselves, and indeed, in the Ruby Bridges story, her father loses his job at a garage because of the fact that the patrons of the garage tell the owner, who's white, if you keep him on we're going to stop bringing our cars here. So you could say, well, the owner, was racist. Well, maybe not. He capitulated to the fact that if he was going to stay in the business, he had to fire Mr. Bridges. And so again, this whole notion of heroism, I think, is evoked in this piece in so many levels. And the other thing that we had talked about was this whole notion of the color line. And Rockwell was a master at this, because you can see that she's passed by or walked across a line in the concrete, but as Vivian, you pointed out, there's another line yet to come as she's walking. And so again, this whole notion of, crossing the color line, but for her, the journey continues, and this piece shows that.
And the other thing that's interesting about this work, besides the fact that she's stuck between those two lines, betwixt and between, if you will, is she's the only person whose face you can see. And she is seen in profile, as are the other figures, but they're faceless. And they also are heroes because they're marching her in and they're protecting her. But they become the faceless, nameless people. She's the only person who can be recognizable. And you wonder, what could this little girl be thinking? Because the isolation of her is so visible in this work. Everything in this work makes her isolated, even though she's walking in, and of course the words on the war nigger, of course, it says it all about what she's going to be facing when she walks into that school.
And the composition of this image, I think, encourages us to question, do we see this young girl as a victim or someone who's triumphant? I think the concept of an anti-hero comes up here. An anti-hero isn't, a person who's not a hero. It's actually a person who is heroic, but comes in a body, in an image, or in a situation that seems unlikely to produce a hero. So they actually kind of, an anti-hero deconstructs the idea of a hero being a special person reserved and set aside from everyone else, but actually welcomes the idea of the everyday heroicism. And I think here, when we initially look at this image, we might initially think, poor young girl. She had to withstand and go through this situation that really rendered her a victim. I think there's some kind of clues or tips that could key us in on her actually being quite heroic and stoic. Not saying that everything was okay internally, but her posture, when we look at her erect posture, I think that tells us something about her strength and the way she's facing this situation. When we look at her forward foot, her front foot, you see that it's up at a higher angle than the other men who are also walking forward. There's this progressive momentum that we see in her stride. And I think also seeing the armbands that the men are wearing that depict them as official people, the kind of official heroes who are there to protect and save her. And her clothing is a bit more formal than you would think for school attire. During this time period, historically, it's not so out of the question, but it still creates this contrast between the men with their armbands and kind of this white dress and the socks that depict this purity, but also strength and preparation. So I think it's helpful for us to look at the posture of her, the construction of this image, and recognize kind of the anti-hero properties that she seems to embody.
I've got a question for all of us, and that is the ruler in her hand. Rockwell is so deliberate and so detailed.
Right.
And of course, there's the school book, but there's the ruler, and I'm wondering about the symbolic significance of the ruler. But the other piece that I want to say is that not only did Rockwell paint this piece for, I believe it was Look magazine, right? He was
Yes.
painting for Look at the time.
That's right.
And previous to this, he had done work for the Post, and I believe that the Post wasn't really wanting him to do these kinds of images. So we see this artistic freedom when he's working for Look magazine. But in terms of the Ruby Bridges story, no less an artist than John Steinbeck also wrote about her in a piece called Travels with Charlie. He happened to be in New Orleans at the time, and so he also writes about this little girl and her heroic action. Again, we have another example of an artist elevating this common person to the status of hero. But I wonder about that ruler.
Gee, I don't know about the ruler. I focus more on the tomato. It was just kind of, and to me, that tomato, the violence of the tomato, having been thrown at her, but then also it's the blood that splatters that becomes a symbol of violence with race in the civil rights era.
And we all can breathe a sigh of relief that the tomato missed her.
Right.
Again, which
Yes.
is great,
And
because she's
her-
wearing that white dress.
Her pure white dress,
Yes.
right, exactly. Well, maybe the ruler is that symbol of education that she has access to, and that you have to pay for the ruler, and, it would be interesting to look into, you're in the School of Education, what kinds of tools were given to black schools? Did they even have rulers? Or because they certainly didn't have the same books and the same supplies.
Right.
So I wonder if anything comes
Yeah, a
into
lot
play
of that
with
is speculation, but I think it's clear that Rockwell is saying that she's going to school to learn. She's going
Yeah.
ready to
And
learn.
she's equipped.
I think that's kind of the
She's
point,
equipped.
yeah.
Yes.
She's equipped to educate academically and socially, we hope, socially.
And I personally love the ruby bridges in this painting. I mean, I really, as a human being, and you can't say that about too many subjects of paintings. I don't know her personally now or didn't know her then, but as a human being, I love her. And I think that notion of admiration for anybody who is bucking the odds, who's courageous, and who is really there as an invitation to you to be her. An
Yes.
invitation to you to stand there with those marshals. And what would you do? And I think that emulation, that word that I used earlier, emulability of an image, I think is really maybe one of the things to me that an artist, a visual maker of images can do in a very different way than a writer can do, is the thing that strikes me about, why is this image so extraordinary? Why has it lasted for so long? And it's interesting to think about that notion of emulation in the context of Kehinde Wiley, whose work absolutely directly confronts this notion of the heroic. By emulating European models, by finding young men on the street that he may or may not really know, that he may pay to be his models, and then placing them into the context of a language of heroism that's inherited from Western European traditions. What is he really telling us about the hero in his works?
I think there's something very interesting when you think about the image on the left, this Renaissance or Western European painting that likely, obviously not by Norman Rockwell, right? But something similar is that often in this era, artists were hired or commissioned by the government, by a royal court, to paint portraits of war heroes, of politicians, of royalty, and that was part of the hero shaping, kind of consciously offering these images of strength, whether they're paintings or major sculptures. The artist was involved in kind of this communication of the image of officials. With Kehinde Wiley, I think we've become very aware of the process of hero shaping, in that it's not that he's been kind of commissioned by an outside source to represent them visually, but he is interested in selecting the body that goes into the role of, the high, very large scale heroes that he reflects in his paintings.
I would say that this work, I think, and I love the fact that it was in the entrance, and if you saw the work, it's huge. Yes. So, first of all, it's created in the style of the Baroque with the gold frame that is not used these days. Secondly, if you know the meaning of the equestrian portrait in the history of art, you know that in ancient Rome, only the emperor could be seen on horseback, so that in the history of art, when you see somebody on horseback, it's elevating that person to that higher level. So what Wiley is doing here is taking a person from the street who we don't know who he is, the artist may not know who he is, and he's elevating him to this status. And I think in doing so, he's deconstructing it and forcing us to question it. And I think what really leads us further down that deconstructing, questioning, is that he's wearing a sweatshirt, and the sweatshirt says Negro League on it. So it has to do with the baseball and the fact that the color line was created so that athletes who were black could not join a league that was integrated. And of course, in our culture, how do you become a hero in the United States? You become a hero by being an athlete. And so it's a road, it's a way in which some African Americans have entered into that heroic status. I think all of that is something that Wiley is asking us to think about and critique and question.
And to echo my colleague Vivian, the regalia that he's wearing is commonplace hip-hop regalia.
Right.
Young people will be wearing the iconography of the Negro Leagues or the old Harlem Globetrotters or whatever. You see that all the time, and it's very loud and it's very brash, and it calls attention to this young man on the horse, and clearly the incongruity of him being on this horse in this, very traditional picture. But it's clearly the kind of image that one would see on the street, quite frankly, in terms of the sweatshirt. But placing it here, there is that incongruity, and it's very striking and arresting when one sees it.
I think there's a really interesting level of empowerment that the artist gives, Kehinde Wiley gives his subjects. He does hire people that he finds, in various places to come in and sit for these portraits, but he gives them art books that they can flip through and select a pose or the painting, through which their painting will eventually be modeled after. So the subjects are empowered to choose the posture in which they'll be seen. And another thing I love about this image, when you look back through the slave codes and laws and rules of the enslaved here in America, it was illegal for Black people to ride horses and learn how to ride horses. Of course, there were horse handlers, and you think about Bellmead Plantation or the Bellmead, it was horse farm at the time, and now we've more recently called it a plantation. But there is this history of Black people handling and training horses and breaking horses, but to reduce the potential of running away, it was illegal for a Black person to be seen on a horse in the majority of the southern states. So then, years later, to see this image, I think is a really powerful juxtaposition.
I think finally, one comment that I have is the question of masculine heroism. To be a man, to be heroic as a man, do you have to be doing manly things? Do you have to be holding a lance? Do you have to be going off to war? And I think Kehinde really questions that as well with his very decorative embellishments, his introduction of an almost Rococo rather than Baroque kind of background. And so that whole notion is embedded in his work as well. Well, do heroes have to have faces? Does anybody know? Do you all know? Do heroes need faces?
I would say no.
Okay. It seems evident that they don't. But I think that was just a little sidebar conversation. But we have a few more slides to go that might have a bit more resonance. Stephanie, you were talking about this kind of the points of access.
Right. I think the Hendricks image on the right and Norman Rockwell's depiction of Abraham Lincoln show us obviously this, the tall stature. They're both full body portraits, strong posture again, and so we see them in these positions of kind of respect and again, hero shaping, but there are small details that really humanize these two figures. I think one having the suspenders on Abraham Lincoln, to the left having the suspenders kind of down, and the fact that he's not wearing his hat, you see his hair is kind of tousled, I think really humanizes us and reminds us that he is a true whole person. With the Barclay Hendricks image, Noir, on the right, the man who's posing is clearly well coiffed. And I think I look at this image and I start to hear a soundtrack in my mind, and I imagine how he walks, and I love imagining that. And he looks very clearly put together. But then we look at a few little details that I think really humanize him. He's wearing a pendant when you look very closely on the image, and it's the number 13, but it's backwards. And so we see this very intentional shaping of his outfit, his hair, all these other things that he took, a lot of time putting together. But then there's, one little thing that's just kind of off that seems to humanize him. And if you look very closely, you see that he actually needs a manicure. And this is, I mean, one of the small things that I noticed, but I think it's amazing to look at this image from 20 feet away, initially approaching it, and then as you get closer up, you notice very small things that humanize him and remind us that heroes, people in leadership positions, are real, everyday people who might put their necklace on backwards.
Well, actually, when I was looking at this work with a group of people, somebody who was on with me commented, which I didn't notice, what you're talking about, and that was not only that he needed a manicure, but one nail, and it was only one nail, was very, very long. And the question was, is that what you used for Coke? And so that's this little detail that one leads you to question it.
Anybody in the audience? No.
Tell us your expertise in that area.
Well, I'm going to try to pick things up a bit. That question of emulation, the common man that we just talked about, the common person that we just talked about. And it really, I think part of what we're discussing is the viewer placing himself or herself into the world that the artist has created and imagining himself or herself within that world. And you can see that in very different ways with Gary Simmons' Duck, Duck, Noose and the wonderful sound suits of Nick Cave. Commentators from W.E.B. Du Bois to Ralph Ellison have spoken about the doubleness and the invisibility of the black in America. And this notion, it can be a very negative notion. It's a repression of something by the white majority, but also it's an opportunity to fill an absence with something. And I think that to me that may be part of the conversation between these two works. One is, you can imagine yourself the hero or the abject hero in Duck, Duck, Noose, or you can imagine yourself filling this grand and majestic suit and becoming transformed through that. Or you can imagine yourself filling one of the white hoods. And so I think it's a very, very interesting and provocative notion of how you place yourself within the work of art. I don't know if any of you have any thoughts about that. I'm editorializing. I know moderators aren't supposed to do that.
Well, this piece has resonance for me, the lynching piece. I'm reminded of the very famous lynching exhibit, Without Sanctuary, that toured for years. But it also has resonance for me in terms of the work of any number of countless writers, Richard Wright et al., who talk about lynching. But of course, the thing that I'm thinking of, based upon your comments, Mark, is that those who are being lynched or who were lynched were indeed invisible heroes. We don't know all their names. Right. We don't know the situations that occasioned this. But indeed, if one begins to read the literature of lynching, one finds out that much of the time these were people who had taken heroic stances, men and women, and as a result of their heroism were then victims of the lynching mob. And so this really does conjure up this notion of the invisible hero.
That's what I think of when I see this work, which is amazingly powerful. You see the empty noose, and the empty noose is the noose that lynched everybody, who really is a nobody because we don't have historical records. We do sometimes, but oftentimes we don't. And we don't know the circumstances that led to it. But then the power is accelerated by looking at the 9 stools with the Ku Klux Klan masks placed on them, but then they also become nameless, and that becomes powerful too because they were nameless. They hid themselves behind the masks, then the humor that he brings in by giving us the title Duck, Duck, Noose, and we know that it's the game and that one person is going to be targeted. And then you start thinking about, well, when you're children, you're playing that so innocently, but somebody then gets thrown out. So all of those things come into play. And then finally, the idea of somebody sitting on the stool like a dunce cap and being punished. So all of those issues come into play when you see this. To me, this is one of the most powerful pieces in the whole exhibition. It was the silence and absence says everything to me.
I love Mark's question about which space are you willing to inhabit or imagine yourself wearing or embodying. The sound suit on the right, I was there. I was already in the mirror dancing and moving, and I'm definitely feeling myself there. Duck Duck News, as I walked towards the image I walked towards it without even noticing it, I was holding my throat. And so it's a question of where did I place myself in that assemblage, which, is a tough question. And are you willing to empathize with that setting and imagine where you might be or might not be? And also just the idea of a mask, a face covering, a body covering, and why we use masks. Sometimes they're protective. Sometimes in the active phase of hero shaping, or, as a politician, if you saw the movie Nixon, there's a great line where he said, "The people need a hero." And he was talking about the propaganda that the whole administration was undergoing to shape the image into someone who would be respected, and all the conscious decisions they were making to kind of create this mask that would be appreciated and respected. So I think masks can be very functional and necessary tools that we use to give a persona, but then we have to ask what's behind the mask, and are the qualities and traits actually there that uphold kind of those roles.
Well, I'm sorry that we're going to have to flip through, but I did want to just make one last mention of the artist as hero, the notion of heroes that the artist himself has that are cultural heroes. In the case of Norman Rockwell, painting his self-portrait along with self-portrait, you can see in the upper right-hand corner of his canvas, the self-portrait of Picasso, of Dürer, and of Van Gogh. So that kind of influence, and you see that, of course, in Basquiat's painting that is really a tribute to Charlie Bird Parker, the famous jazz musician. And then Glenn Ligon's wonderful painting from a series of paintings taken from James Baldwin's books. In this case, this James Baldwin story of being in Switzerland and kind of the feelings of racism that he encountered there. So I think that kind of tribute, that kind of heroic influence is something that is oftentimes a very private communication from the artist to his influence or her influence, and not necessarily something that we're privy to. But I would also like to just kind of conclude with the notion of the artists themselves in the context of heroism. What do you all think about that? Do you think that's overstating it, or is there something heroic about the work of many of these artists?
I believe risk-taking is heroic. I believe making distinct statements about the world around you and being a cultural creator can be heroic, depending on the content of the work. I would definitely add Norman Rockwell's picture here for a couple of reasons. As an artist, as a literary artist myself, I find it heroic when an artist debunks the starving artist image, and Norman Rockwell is definitely one who found a way to do his work with integrity, but within a commercial setting. He also drew a line at a certain point and decided he would not work for a publication if he was not able to comment on the social realities around him. I find that heroic. Carrie Mae Weems and Kara Walker have very actively dealt with history and very challenging social issues in their work in a way that, sometimes possibly threatens even their ability to make a living. And I think they're both doing quite well now, but, as young artists, they made some decisions that put them on the fringes at times, and I find that heroic and highly respectable.
Well, I think we will conclude with a performance by Stephanie, and then we'll open the field to questions. Stephanie?
Sure. So the image you see is by John Bankston. It's entitled Rehearsal. And one thing that I'm really interested in is how artists can consciously create open space within an image, kind of painting absence. When you look at this canvas, initially it reminded me of a coloring book, but as I got close, the spaces that look white that haven't been filled in are actually painted. There are many layers. So it's this conscious creation of a space where the viewer can kind of fill in what can be seen. And I think often heroes do encourage us. They encourage the audience to do something, to act, to think, to move, to be involved in creation. So I see that happening in the John Bankston image. So I have a poem for you that's entitled sound and silence. It's the idea of creating silence as a space for other people to offer their voices. I sometimes mouth the words to hymns, no sound coming from my throat. Call it lazy, call it memory lapse, call it a simple show. No. Call it faith in the voice of the audience, a belief in others' ability to fill in the blanks. Call it rehearsal, visualizing the path in advance of the steps, showing up despite my moments of disbelief, hanging the whole picture of myself, all complete and in progress.
That was beautiful, Stephanie, and completely apropos of our conversation. So now we'd love to have a chat with you, conversation with you. Are there any questions? I think we have microphones and ushers who will take you to the microphone on either side, or if you wish to just stand up and shout, that's fine as well. Any thoughts or comments? Wow, we covered the terrain so thoroughly that we left no room for questions. Here we go. All right, well, thank you very much for being here. We appreciate your coming. The Norman Rockwell exhibition is open, and we look forward to seeing you back.